Well, would you looky what we have here? 2005 Mini Cooper. It's here because occasionally it will not crank on a hot restart. As far as I know, it starts all the time when it's cold, but when it's hot, shut off, it won't crank. Well, it kind of clicked there. There's no warning lights on. But we're going to throw a network scan on it and see if there's any fault codes related to security. So this is a new vehicle. Should automatically ID. 2005. Let's see if it will automatically ID. I wonder if it's going to let me scan it with it running. Okay, I'll get the mileage later. Is it equipped with a CVT? I don't know. It's not a standard, so I guess so. Let's do a code scan. Pre-scan. Now this might take a few seconds, so I'll pick up when we get to the end. Okay, so we're done the network scan. We've got several codes related to speed sensors in the ABS. Front left, rear right, rear left. CAN data error code. Central body electronics, we've got internal fault in the control unit, internal voltage, so it could be battery voltage is low or something. LWR rear sensor interruption. Heated windscreen relay. Rain sensor, no check back on K-bus. Fuse interior lights, wiper rear relay activation, high beam headlight. Unlocking drive, rear lid, wiper blocked, wiper rear, high beam headlight right, left and right, might have HIDs in it or something. Fuse power window driver, compressor no response, brake light. Nothing related to security though. And that's it. Nothing related to security, so I don't think it's a problem with the security system. I think I'm leaning more towards a conventional starter problem. So let's have a look at the starter electrical circuit. So I got the car idling to get the starter hot, just in case it breaks down when it gets hot. So here's the electrical diagram from Identifix. The ignition switch supplies a signal to the electronic immobilizer control unit, which directly controls the S wire at the starter. There is no starter relay per se. This is the starter motor. So we could test it at this S terminal on the starter if we can get to it, or this wire X6011, wherever that is located. I think it's probably best to try to get right to the starter motor itself. I'm going to go back into the diagnostic suite here and go into the immobilizer, just in case it did not get scanned when I did that network scan. No codes. Let's see if there's any data related to the starter. I'd like to be watching this. Starter block due to BC code, starter block due to part number or PN. Starter enabled, yes. Well, there's some data there. So it's recording this data. I'm going to try and shut it off and restart it. Well, that's interesting. Let me show you what's going on. Now I think it'll start now. But when I shut it off and turned the key back on, none of the dash lit up. It was like the ignition switch didn't recognize anything. And he's got two different keys here. This is the new key that he has. Well, that's weird, but nothing lit up. None of the instrumentation lit up. It's funny that this is red like this after 6. I guess that's the red line. Well, I'm going to let it idle again. I'm going to try this again. Based on what I saw, with no dash lit up whatsoever, I'm leaning more towards an ignition switch problem. So I'm going to look at some case histories and see if there's any cases of this problem. So I'm logged into Identifix looking for a no crank symptom on this Mini, and it mentions starter and ignition switch to be the top 2 causes. And I would think if it was the immobilizer causing a problem, we would have a code of some kind. But we lost communication when I turned the key off and back on, and none of the dash lit up. None of the instrumentation lit up. And I walked over here to look, and it had lost communication. Then I heard the chime activate, and I looked at the dash and it was lit up, and of course that's when I started recording the dash, and it was starting every time. Not crank over or start. No crank, no start. Clutch pedal, well, this is an automatic. Starter will not operate intermittently. Check faults with a factory compatible scan tool, perform battery and charging system tests, correct any charging system or battery problems, perform a voltage drop test, and 10 cases where they replaced the ignition switch to fix that. Replaced ignition switch, replaced ignition switch. I'm certainly leaning towards an ignition switch problem because the instrumentation didn't come on. If it was a starter problem, the dash should light up, you know, the radio should play. Nothing was working inside as far as I could tell. I'm going to see if I can get it to do it again. Okay, I'm going to do exactly what I did before. Turn the key off, turn the key back on. No, it's going to start. I'm going to talk to the customer and find out if, when it doesn't crank, if the gauges light up. Because when I turned it off, it was just like that. I turned the key back on and nothing lit up. And he says he waits 10-15 minutes and the vehicle starts fine. Okay, we're going to try this a third time. Lights out. No. I can't get a hold of the customer, so I'm going to wait for him to call me back. But my research indicates it's fairly common for the switch to cause this problem. And an interesting thing I found is it also causes problems with the wipers randomly working for no reason. I think there were some wiper codes in this thing, if I recall. So I'm reviewing the system report when I scanned it, and I see rain sensor, no check back on K-bus, wiper rear relay activation or open circuit, wiper block, relay or reset contact, wiper relay blocked or reset. There's some weirdness going on in here. I'm going to wait till I talk to the customer. In the meantime, I'm going to check for check for availability of that ignition switch. I'm going to ask him if he's experienced any weirdness with the wipers coming on by themselves, either front or rear. So it's the next morning and the engine's had a chance to cool off. The starter lives underneath the shield under the exhaust manifold. So I was looking to see if there's access to the S terminal on the starter, because I'd like to put a test light on it. But it doesn't look like it's all that convenient. I'm going to lift it up and look from underneath in case there's more access from underneath. Put that rubber seal back in place. Yeah, let's lift it up and have a look. So looking from underneath this vehicle, there's an electric cooling fan here. I believe that's for the power steering electric motor. That's this motor right here. You can see the starter up above it. You see that sort of greenish cable coming out. That's the motor cable. So if I take this cooling fan out of the way, I might be able to reach up there. Let's try that. So with that cooling fan out of the way, cute little cooling fan which is seized. Interesting. I don't think that's working. Well, that's secondary. That control wire, you can see it looping out of the starter right in the middle of the screen there. I looked up there with a borescope. The connection looks clean, but I can't get at it. I can barely get my hand up in here. There's no way you're getting the terminals off. So we're going to look at the electrical diagram, see if there's another connector. It did show another connector somewhere that we can tie in and check for battery power being sent down to the control wire on the starter. I guess I better tell them about this cooling fan. Easy enough to service. 2 bolts hold it on. So I'm looking at the electrical diagram. This is the OEM version of the diagram, and from the electronic immobilizer control unit, it leaves, I guess this is circuit S-50, and it's an SW-GE wire, so we don't know what color that is because this is obviously got to be translated. Goes to connector X6011, wherever that's located. So I'm going to write that down, X6011, and I'm going to look at the there's no legend on this diagram, unfortunately, to tell me what the colors are. So I'm going to look at the color wiring diagram, which is Mitchell version of this diagram, and see if it shows the Mitchell redraws the diagrams. Engine controls, power starting, battery electronic. Let's try this. SW I think is white. Okay, ignition switch, immobilizer, no, black and yellow. And you see how this diagram doesn't show that connector. So it's a black yellow wire we're chasing. I'm just writing this down. It says even I can get close to that circuit in the harness to tee into that wire to see if I'm getting control power being sent down there. I talked to the customer last night and he wasn't completely sure if the dash lights came on when it did its problem. He said he heard noises like it was trying to boot up, computers, relays buzzing, stuff like that, but wasn't completely sure whether the dash lights lit up like I noticed yesterday. So it's basically a conventional ignition switch. Sends direct power to the immobilizer, but then the immobilizer sends direct power And the immobilizer is on the left side of the dash, so I suppose we could find the immobilizer and check for power leaving pin 1. Let's see if it shows where this connector view is. Connector OEM locations X6011. Let's type that in. X6011. Search. Plug-in COM type solder connector. Okay, it's not a convertible. Oh, that's intermediate connector 10-pin engine plug connector. Well, that's in the engine bay. Let me see if I can find that. So that connector is a big bulkhead connector. Looks like you would disconnect that connector to do engine work. Here it is right here. This is it right here. So we're going to see if we can locate that control wire and test it right there, and hopefully the wire between here and the starter is not a problem. So if you pop the plastic cover off the top, there's just 3 little clips. You can see the wires going into it. Now there's a black white wire in pin 18, but I thought it said it was pin 8. Oh, black yellow, wasn't it black yellow? I'll figure it out. So according to the schematic, it was pin 8, and if you look carefully on this, you can see that black yellow wire, which is a fairly heavy wire, which would stand to reason because it's a control solenoid, is the wire. So we're going to slide a back pin into that wire between the seal and the wire. I'm going to try anyways. Good thing it's not a molded connector. And put a test light on that wire where we can see it, so that test light should illuminate every time the starter is being commanded to crank. Okay, so I've got the test light connected to that wire, so it should light whenever it's cranking. So what I'm going to do is extend that test light out onto the wiper blade where I can see it from under the hood, and drive the car for a few minutes and get it warm and see if it'll act up again. So I put the test light out by the wiper blade, as you can see there. So every time we start the vehicle, the test light should come on. So I'm going to take this out and get it hot and see if it'll act up. I'm driving it at 60 miles an hour, and there's a shimmy from the front wheels. I noticed the front tires are worn on the inboard edges, so it's got tire problems, tire balance, cord separation. You can see that. Well, I don't know if you can make it out in the video. Steer straight. Got no hands on the steering wheel, and it is not going left or right, but you can see the shimmy in it. Secondary issue. So I just got back from about a 10-kilometer road test, and I don't know if it's going to be hot enough to act up because it's a pretty cool day today. Didn't have the AC on at all. So let's shut it off and restart it. Now it's working fine. Well, I'm going to let it idle here for a while and see if that makes a difference. At least until the cooling fans cycle. Well, let's try it again. Well, I might have to give it back to the customer with this test light taped to the windshield, and let's see what happens. But yesterday, when it acted up for me, the entire instrumentation was dead, and I had no communication with the immobilizer module on the scan tool. Then, without doing anything, just with the key in the run position, everything came back to life, and of course it started. I'm not turning the key to crank, I'm just turning the key on. Well, I'm gonna have to discuss this with the customer. Well, that's interesting. Let me show you what's going on. So while I'm sitting here letting this thing get hot, I noticed when I was re-watching my video where the starter didn't work or the ignition switch appeared not to work, I noticed that the diagnostic connector showed on the scan tool that it lost power. And I thought, well, that's odd. And then when it came back, it showed the battery voltage on the bottom of the scan tool. It shows the battery voltage. So I was looking at the DLC connector, and the DLC connector gets its power from fuse, looks like 35 here or 36, and that actually comes from the ignition switch, which is unlike most vehicles. Most vehicles, the ignition switch or the power at the DLC is live all the time, but it appears that this one's only live with the key in the run or start, not even on accessory. So I was starting to chase a potential power feed to the ignition switch as a cause of the problem, because I assumed that the DLC connector would be live all the time like most other manufacturers, but it's not. So that suggested that we lost power, and of course it could still be the ignition switch. This ignition switch feeds this fuse, this fuse, this fuse, this fuse, and other circuits. So there's quite a bit. I'm going to try it one more time. Okay, let's shut it off. Wait a few seconds. Turn the key. No. But the scan tool did indicate that it lost battery voltage at the diagnostic connector. So that's another suggestion that the ignition switch is faulty. I think for the price of an ignition switch, I think it's about 150 bucks. It's not a huge problem to change, unless the customer wants to drive this thing with this test light taped to the windshield for a couple of days, and with a little knowledge on what to watch for. Oh well. Well, I just want to see if I actually lose power at the VCM here when I turn the key off. And you see if it'll act up one more time. Well, that diagram's not right, because we still have power at the DLC. But on the scan tool, it lost power. Maybe that diagram is for European applications, but I thought it was a requirement of North American OBD2 standards that the DLC be live all the time, and it appears that this one is. So we're back to a potential power supply to the ignition switch and whatever feeds the DLC. The plot thickens. So I decided to plug in my breakout box so I could see the voltage at the DLC. So you can see it is live all the time. This is pin 16 at the DLC, and 4 and 5 are grounds, and it's reading 12.6 volts. but I saw it on the scan tool where it lost the voltage from the... So obviously that wiring diagram is not correct. That is not key switched as the diagram indicates. So we're on the information system looking at this connector, data link connector, unless that's a different data link connector, because that says pin 1 on the data link connector and it's pin 16 on the diagnostic connector, and that says it comes from Fuse. So they may have a proprietary data link connector for other markets. Oh boy. I'm going to look at the actual data link connector circuit. So here's Mitchell's version of the data link connector circuit. Pin 16 goes directly to fuse 3 from the fuse holder 2 behind the left footwell, and that says hot all time. So there must be another proprietary mini data link connector utilized in other markets. I hate that. So here's an OE diagram of the OBD2 X19527 connector. So pin 16 comes from fuse 3, 5 amp, and it notes location 30 or terminal 30, which is a hot at all time source, and 4 and 5 both go to grounds. The rest are, there's another power wire on pin 1. That's interesting. Why would they have 2 power wires? So that comes from fuse 36. So they actually have 2 power wires. I'm going to see if that LED is lit up. So looking at my breakout box, the LED on pin 1 of the breakout box is actually blinking rapidly, like there's data transmission on it, yet it shows this comes from a fuse. So there's so many variables here. I'm wasting a bunch of time. I think we're just going to throw a part at it. I don't like to do that, but I'm going to discuss it with the customer and give them the options of driving it with some test equipment on it and see when it acts up, because I've had it running for 2 hours now, and I've tried it a dozen times and it's never missed a beat. So you can see this is pin 1 and it's actually flashing, and according to the schematic, the OE schematic, that should be live with the key on. Turn the key off. It does shut off, but it should be live all the time. It should be just on like this red one here. Let's try starting it. See, that's a data wire, that's not a fused wire. You can see that it's blinking to indicate there's data transmission, as is this one right here. Well, I'm going to discuss this with the customer.